I was halfway through lifting my fork when my father said my name in Japanese, calm and precise the way he spoke, only when he thought he was being strategic. Lena is the kind of smart that becomes a problem. The 5.2 million goes to Ryan, and we keep Lena calm. The words landed in the air above the dining table, like a decision already signed, already sealed. The kitchen light was warm yellow, almost gentle. The sound of silverware touching ceramic plates continued, like nothing had happened. The television in the living room murmured about a late-night weather update. My younger brother, Ryan, leaned back in his chair, smiling at something on his phone. No one was looking at me. My hand froze mid-air, a forkful of salad trembling just enough that I noticed my own breath stop. I did not look up. I did not blink. I did not react. I let the moment pass exactly the way they expected it to. Frank continued speaking his tone, casual now, still in Japanese, still confident that I was invisible to the conversation. We will move the shares and the scholarship fund before she even notices. Clean transfers, no signatures from her. He laughed softly, the sound of a man who believed he was being clever, who believed control was the same thing as intelligence. Ryan chuckled without understanding the language, but he did not need to. He understood the numbers. He understood the tone. He understood that he was winning something he had not earned. "She will be fine," Ryan said in English, waving a hand in my direction. "She always is." That was the moment I understood the full shape of what they had decided. This was not favoritism. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a plan. A quiet one, a practiced one. They were not angry with me. They were not emotional. They were simply done accounting for me as a person who required explanation. I chewed slowly. I swallowed. I nodded at the appropriate moments. Frank switched back to English when a family friend at the table asked about work, and he smiled at me the way you smile at something you believe is manageable. "Lena helps with small things," he said. "Translations, little tasks. She is more comfortable that way." Ryan snorted. I forced a polite smile. Inside, something went cold and steady. I did not stand up. I did not yell. I did not ask what he meant or demand clarification. I did something worse for them. I started documenting. While they talked about logistics, about timing, about making sure everything was done before the end of the quarter, I listened for details. Words like trust. Words like transfer. Words like fund. Frank mentioned Evergreen without thinking, as if the name of the trust services firm was already too familiar to bother hiding. Ryan nodded when Frank said 5.2 again, his eyes lighting up, greedy and proud. I noticed the way my father avoided looking at me when he said the word calm. Calm was not kindness. Calm was containment. I excused myself to use the bathroom with the same soft voice I had used my entire adult life. Inside the small guest bathroom, I locked the door and turned on the faucet to drown out the sound of my breathing. My reflection looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes earlier. Composed, agreeable, unremarkable. I pulled my phone from my pocket and saw the email notification waiting on my screen. From a director. Subject line, final approval pending. I turned the screen off the moment I heard footsteps in the hallway. They had no idea what my real work touched. They had no idea whose signatures I had seen appear on documents that never crossed our dinner table. I returned to my seat and finished my meal. Frank made another comment about family legacy. Ryan asked about timing. No one asked me anything. When dessert arrived, Frank leaned toward a visiting associate and said something under his breath about how daughters complicate things. I smiled and passed the plates. Later that night, after the table was cleared and Ryan had left with a satisfied wave, I stood alone in the hallway outside the bathroom again, this time long enough to let the silence press in. I opened my messages and typed one sentence. "Do you still handle estates? I need a quiet review tonight." I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not ask myself why this was happening. I already knew. I had been smiling while being erased for years. This was just the first time I heard it out loud, and by the time they realized I understood everything they had said, the paperwork was already moving. If you have ever been smiled at while decisions were made to remove you from your own life, do not leave. This is where it turns. By the time the oven timer chimed for the second time, Frank had already decided where everyone would sit. He did it the way he always did, with a quick glance, and a pointed gesture, as if arranging people was no different than setting plates. Ryan got the chair at the head of the table closest to the counter where the wine bottles stood. I was placed to Frank's right, close enough to hear instructions, but far enough to be ignored when conversation turned important. The house in Bellevue looked calm from the outside, clean lines, trimmed hedges, lights glowing softly through the windows, the kind of place neighbors assumed ran on mutual respect. Inside, the air felt managed. Frank hovered over the counter, tasting sauce, adjusting heat, correcting the way I set the napkins. "No, fold them the other way," he said without looking up. And Lena just smiled tonight. "Don't overcomplicate things." I nodded the same way I always did and adjusted the napkins again. This was not new. Control here was quiet domestic, wrapped in the language of efficiency. Frank decided who poured the wine when the conversation started, when it shifted, and when it ended. Ryan played along easily, laughing at the right moments, accepting praise like it was his due. I moved between kitchen and dining area, filling glasses, carrying plates, absorbing small comments that landed harder because they were delivered casually. Frank watched me, the way a supervisor watches an employee, attentive only to mistakes. Ryan talked about a potential business idea. He had been thinking about something vague involving partnerships and growth. And Frank leaned in, visibly pleased. "That's a real business brain you have," Frank said, raising his glass toward Ryan. "This is how you think when you're building something." Then his eyes flicked toward me, and his tone softened into something that sounded like kindness, but never was. "And Lena, you're good at being agreeable. You always know how to keep things smooth." Ryan smiled at me as if this were a compliment we both shared. I returned the smile, polite and measured, and felt the familiar pressure in my chest settle into place. Agreeable was a word Frank used often. It meant predictable. It meant compliant. It meant useful without being threatening. My work came up the way it always did, indirectly and briefly. Ryan asked if I was still doing that translation thing, and Frank answered for me. "She works remote," he said, waving a hand. "Mostly documents, nothing flashy. Keeps her busy." He laughed lightly, and Ryan followed. They called it my translation gig, a harmless phrase that shrank months of focused work into something casual and disposable. I did not correct him. The documents I handled were confidential. The systems I logged into were not things you talked about over dinner. I had learned early that sharing details only invited dismissal or control. So I kept my work contained remote, quiet, protected behind passwords, and a cloud folder no one else knew existed. That folder held financial records of my own backups, statements, timelines. I did not open it now. I did not need to. Just knowing it was there was enough. Dinner continued under Frank's steady orchestration. He directed conversation away from anything uncomfortable, steered it back whenever Ryan wandered corrected details with a sharp glance. When I paused too long before answering a question, he filled the silence for me. When I stood to clear plates, he reminded me to take Ryan's first. These were small things, ordinary things, the kind of moments people outside the house would never question. But together they formed a system that made one thing clear. Ryan was being prepared. I was being managed. At one point, Frank leaned back and looked around the table with satisfaction. "Family works best when everyone knows their role," he said. Ryan nodded, already comfortable in the one assigned to him. I lowered my eyes and continued clearing dishes. The rhythm of the evening felt practiced, like a rehearsal they had been running for years. Every now and then Frank glanced at me and said something that sounded encouraging but landed as instruction. "You're doing great, Lena. Just keep things simple." I thought about the folder on my cloud drive, the one labeled with a neutral name that meant nothing to anyone else. I thought about the files inside it, organized and current. I thought about how simplicity was often just another word for silence. As dessert plates were set down, Ryan launched into another story about potential investors, and Frank listened closely, asking questions, offering suggestions. When I added a small comment about timing, Frank smiled thinly. "Let's not overthink it," he said. "This isn't your lane." The words were gentle. The boundary was not. I felt the familiar urge to retreat, to make myself smaller, to smooth the moment. Instead, I nodded and took a sip of water, letting the urge pass without acting on it. The evening wound down the way it always did, with Frank standing to signal the end, Ryan stretching and checking his phone, me gathering dishes and wiping counters. When Ryan left, Frank retreated to his home office without a word, the door closing softly behind him. I finished cleaning and turned off the lights in the kitchen, the quiet settling around me. As I passed Frank's office on the way to the hallway, something on his desk caught my eye. A cream-colored envelope heavier than regular mail sat near the edge. The logo on the corner was clean and professional, unmistakable to anyone who had dealt with paperwork long enough. An estate law firm. I did not touch it. I did not slow my pace. I let my eyes register the name, the placement, the fact that it was already open, as if recently reviewed. Then I kept walking. Agreeable, I thought, was just another word for controllable. And standing there in the quiet hallway with the image of that envelope burned into my memory, I understood that nothing at that table had been accidental. The longer I stayed quiet, the more invisible I seemed to become, and with that invisibility came a kind of permission. Frank never said out loud, but acted on constantly. It was not loud abuse or dramatic cruelty. It was the slow erosion of presence, the way decisions were made without me, because it had become normal not to ask. I remembered the first time it happened clearly, because at the time I still believed it was an exception. It was 2 years earlier, late spring, when I brought up the idea of enrolling in a specialized professional program. Nothing extravagant, just an advanced course that would deepen my expertise and open doors I knew existed. I explained it carefully, the way you do when you have learned that enthusiasm can be used against you. Frank listened with a polite smile, then laughed short and dismissive. "That's cute," he said, the same way someone might talk to a child showing a drawing. "But Ryan needs real investment right now." He didn't look at me when he said it. The conversation shifted immediately to Ryan's plans, his needs, his potential. My request vanished into the space between sentences. I told myself it was timing. I told myself there would be another chance. That was the pattern. Over time, it became easier for Frank to justify decisions by reframing them as practicality. When he first mentioned borrowing from my education fund, he did it casually, almost apologetically. "Just temporarily," he said. "Cash flow thing." I'll put it back. Family helps family. I believed him because believing him was easier than confronting what it meant not to. The fund had been set aside years earlier, partly from my mother's planning, partly from savings that were always described as shared. I agreed because at that point I still thought agreement meant cooperation, not surrender. Months passed, then more months. No repayment. When I asked gently, Frank waved it off. "We'll settle it later. Don't worry about that." He said it the way you say something that is no longer open for discussion. I stopped asking. The real shift came quietly buried in an email thread I almost ignored. One afternoon, while searching for an old document related to my work, I typed the name of the education fund into my inbox search. What came up was not what I expected. The subject line had changed. Education fund no longer existed as a label. In its place was something called Ryan Development. The email was months old, forwarded between Frank and a financial contact, discussing restructuring and naming conventions. I read it twice, then a third time slower. The name change was presented as administrative, but I understood enough to know it was not harmless. Names on financial structures matter. They indicate intent. They redirect purpose. I did not confront Frank. I saved the email. That was the moment I stopped thinking in terms of fairness and started thinking in terms of documentation. When I brought up the fund again, framing it as a question about records, Frank's tone hardened. Family money stays with the one who carries the family name forward, he said, as if this were an established principle rather than a convenient justification. Ryan nodded beside him, silent but satisfied. The statement landed heavier than it sounded. It told me exactly where I stood in Frank's hierarchy. My value was conditional. My claim was negotiable. My presence was optional. I thought about the documents I had once seen years earlier when my mother was still alive. Back then, my name had been included without question. I remembered her voice calm and deliberate, explaining that things were set up to protect balance, not favoritism. You don't always need to use what's written, she had said once, but it matters that it's there. At the time, I had not fully understood what she meant. Now standing alone in my apartment late at night, staring at the email where my education fund had been quietly renamed, I felt the weight of that memory settle into place. My name was on those documents too once. That realization hurt more than the money itself. It meant something had been deliberately undone, not accidentally forgotten, but actively changed. Frank never mentioned the rename to me. He never explained why funds earmarked for my development were being redirected. Instead, he leaned harder on language about unity, about tradition, about responsibility. Every conversation carried an unspoken message. Do not question this. Do not complicate this. Do not make this about you. And for a long time, I did what I had always done. I absorbed it. I stayed polite. I stayed agreeable. I stayed silent while my future was being rewritten in accounting language I was not supposed to read. The invisibility became complete when Frank stopped even pretending to justify decisions to me. He spoke about assets and plans openly with Ryan in the room, using terms he assumed I would not follow. He did not bother lowering his voice. I realized then that invisibility was not a side effect. It was the strategy. Late one evening, after another conversation where my role had been reduced to an afterthought, I sat at my desk and opened a folder I had not touched in years. Inside were scanned copies of old documents my mother had insisted I keep, trust outlines, beneficiary notes, conditions written in careful legal language. I did not read them all that night. I did not need to. One sentence surfaced in my memory, clear and unmistakable. There are conditions, she had said. Not everything is as simple as it looks. No one had mentioned those conditions since her death. Frank certainly had not. As I closed the folder, I understood that what was happening was bigger than favoritism. It was a quiet erasure backed by paperwork, and somewhere inside that paperwork was a truth no one at the table had bothered to confirm. I did not learn Japanese because it was interesting or exotic, or because I wanted a hobby Frank could dismiss with a smile. I learned it because a long-term project required it, and because the work demanded precision that shortcuts could not provide. Years earlier, a client based in Tokyo had asked for continuity, not surface-level translation, but operational understanding, the kind that recognizes hierarchy intent and what is left unsaid. That meant business Japanese, not conversational phrases. It meant keigo, the formal register that signals respect and power dynamics, the kind of language used in boardrooms and legal discussions. I studied quietly, methodically, after hours during weekends, building fluency the same way I built everything else in my life without announcement. By the time Frank began switching languages at the dinner table, I understood far more than he imagined. I could hear the weight of his words, the assumptions folded into his phrasing, the way he framed inheritance as a managerial decision rather than a moral one. When he said, "Keep Lena calm," he used a tone reserved for operational risks, not family members. He spoke as if he were managing exposure. I understood that because I had spent years listening to similar language in professional settings, learning when politeness masks control. I never told my family about the certifications I earned along the way. They came in plain envelopes stamped and signed evidence of competency that would have raised questions I did not want to answer. I placed them in a small box at the back of my closet beneath old sweaters and documents no one ever asked about. Reference letters arrived by email and by mail, written by people whose titles Frank would have recognized immediately, but I never forwarded them or printed them for display. I learned early that success, when visible, became a lever. I did not want a family that weaponized my success, that reframed my achievements as assets to be controlled or redirected. So I kept my accomplishments contained portable mine. The work paid well enough to be sustainable, not in a dramatic way, but steadily. When a project wrapped early and a bonus came through, I did not announce it. I opened a separate account in my own name and let the balance sit there quietly. It was not a fortune. It was not something that would change my life overnight. It was enough to remind me that dependence was a choice I no longer had to make. I paid my expenses, contributed where expected, and kept the rest untouched. Quiet does not look like power until you need it. At family gatherings, Frank continued to describe my work as translation, as if language were mechanical rather than strategic. Ryan repeated the label without thinking comfortable in the belief that his ambitions were larger by default. I listened and took notes in my head, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. When you understand how people underestimate you, you also understand how they plan. I began to see patterns in Frank's timing, the way conversations about assets aligned with filing periods, the way he avoided specifics when dates mattered. I did not challenge him. I did not reveal comprehension. I watched. I practiced hearing everything without reacting. The dinner where Frank outlined the plan for the inheritance was not the first time he had spoken about money in Japanese. It was simply the first time he said something that could not be misinterpreted. I understood every level of it, from the numbers to the intent to the assumption that I was outside the conversation. That assumption was the mistake. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet and the city lights reflected off the water beyond my window, I took inventory, not of money, but of access. I knew where documents were kept. I knew which firms Frank trusted. I recognized names he dropped casually, assuming they meant nothing to me. Evergreen was one of them. I had encountered it before in a professional context, not directly, but enough to understand its role. I opened my laptop and pulled up a calendar marking potential filing windows based on standard practice. I checked public records for changes in corporate filings, not to act, just to confirm patterns. Everything aligned with what I had heard at the table. That alignment was not coincidence. It was preparation. I thought again about the box in my closet, the certificates and letters I had never shown anyone. I thought about the email from the director that had arrived earlier that day, the one I had closed quickly when Ryan walked by. Final approval pending was not a promise. It was an indicator. It told me timing mattered. I was not broke. I was quiet. That distinction shaped every decision I made next. I did not confront Frank about the renamed fund. I did not ask Ryan why he seemed so confident. I did not bring up my mother's documents yet. I waited, gathering context the way I had been trained to do professionally. When you move too early, you reveal what you know. When you wait, you see what others reveal about themselves. By the end of that week, my path was clear. I would confirm the estate timeline, month by month, lawyer by lawyer, filing by filing. Not as an accusation, but as a beneficiary exercising her right to understand what was being done in her name and without her consent. The decision felt calm, almost procedural. I wrote it down in a notebook I kept for work, one line among many. I will confirm the estate timeline, month, lawyer, filings. Then I closed the notebook and turned off the light, knowing that everything I needed was already in motion, even if no one else could see it yet. The dinner replayed in my mind not as a single moment, but as a sequence of small, cutting remarks that had been sharpened by intent. When Frank shifted back into Japanese, his posture changed shoulders, squared voice firm in the way men sound when they believe they are speaking only to those who matter. He gestured lightly toward me without looking, as if indicating an object rather than a person, and said she gets ideas. The phrase was brief, almost casual, but the tone carried a warning. Ideas in his mouth meant disruption. Ideas meant questions. Ideas meant a loss of control. Ryan glanced up at him, reading the room the way he always did, alert not to language, but to opportunity. Frank continued explaining that certain people complicate things by thinking too much, by wanting to understand processes that are better left to management. He said this as if it were common sense, as if the table would naturally agree. I kept my eyes on my plate, letting the words pass through me while I cataloged them carefully. In the world Frank operated in, ideas were only valuable when they belonged to him or to someone he had chosen to elevate. When he spoke about the company's shares, he did not frame it as inheritance or fairness. He framed it as efficiency. "We will move the company's shares into a trust for Ryan," he said, still in Japanese, outlining it like a standard procedure. "That way we avoid unnecessary signatures." He did not say my name, but he did not need to. Signature avoidance was not an abstract concept. It was a tactic. It meant structuring things so that consent was no longer required from the person being excluded. Frank described it with pride, as if he were explaining a clever workaround rather than an ethical boundary crossed. He talked about timing, about filing windows, about making sure everything was completed before the end of the cycle. Ryan leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpened by numbers he recognized even if he did not understand the language. 5.2. Transfer, trust. Those words were enough. He watched Frank's face the way people watch stock tickers reading confidence and momentum. When Frank nodded, Ryan smiled. He did not need Japanese. He needed greed. Frank made a joke, then something about how daughters get emotional when paperwork is involved, how it was better to spare them the stress. I felt my jaw tighten for a fraction of a second before I forced it loose again. Stress was another word he used when he meant resistance. He continued by mentioning that the trust would be handled through a firm he trusted, one he had worked with before. He said the name without emphasis, as if it were unimportant. Evergreen Trust Services. The words landed softly, but they landed. I did not look up. I did not react. I memorized them. As the conversation moved on, Frank spoke about leadership and stability, about how the family needed a clear line of authority going forward. Ryan nodded along, absorbing the narrative that placed him at the center of everything that mattered. At one point, Ryan laughed and said something in English about how I would probably prefer not to deal with complicated documents anyway. Frank smiled approvingly. "She likes things simple," he said. He did not ask me if that was true. He stated it as a fact that supported his plan. I felt the familiar pressure to smooth the moment rise again, the instinct to reassure them that I was fine, that I did not need anything, that I was grateful. I let the instinct pass. Instead, I listened harder. Frank referenced the trust structure again, mentioning how certain assets could be moved internally without triggering review if done correctly. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this explanation, who had already convinced himself it was clean. Ryan watched closely, his eyes flicking between Frank's hands and the documents partially visible near his plate. Numbers were written there, not clearly enough to read from where I sat, but clearly enough for Ryan to recognize their scale. He leaned back satisfied, as if the outcome were already his. I noticed the way Frank avoided any mention of my mother when he spoke about the trust. He talked about legacy and continuity, but never about intention. That absence was loud. As dessert arrived, Frank grew more relaxed, his voice loosening as the plan took shape in the open air between them. He referred to me once more, this time with a laugh. "Lena is smart, but she gets ideas. Best to keep her focused on her lane." The words were not shouted. They were not dramatic. They were said the way decisions are finalized. I felt a strange calm settle over me, then a clarity that came from understanding exactly how little room they had left for me. When the conversation shifted back to English, Frank praised Ryan again, calling him the future of the family, the one who would carry things forward properly. Ryan flushed with pride. I passed the plates, my hands steady, my face neutral. Inside, every piece of the puzzle aligned. The insults were not personal. They were strategic. The plan was not emotional. It was administrative. That made it more dangerous and easier to dismantle if handled correctly. As the night wound down, Frank stood and stretched, satisfied. He mentioned Evergreen Trust Services one more time, this time in English, as if confirming it aloud made it real. I stored the name away. When Ryan left, slapping Frank on the back and thanking him, I stayed behind to help clean up. Frank retreated to his office, already mentally moving on. I rinsed dishes and wiped counters, replaying the phrases that mattered, the ones that revealed intent. She gets ideas, avoids signatures, trust for Ryan, evergreen. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of running water. When I finally turned off the lights, I did not feel small. I felt informed. He did not need Japanese. He needed greed. And greed, once documented, has a way of collapsing under its own weight. The collapse did not look the way people imagine it does. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no sleepless night pacing the floor. It was quieter than that, heavier in a way that settled and stayed. I did not confront Frank or Ryan after the dinner. I did not ask for explanations or demand fairness. Instead, something in me shifted into a familiar professional state, the one I used when a project went off track, and the only way forward was clarity. I stopped reacting and started auditing. I opened a notebook and wrote a simple list, not of accusations, but of questions. When did the education fund change names? Which lawyer handled the trust? What filings had already occurred, and which were pending? I added dates where I could, leaving space to fill in gaps later. The rule was simple. Verify, do not accuse. Accusations invite denial. Verification builds leverage. Over the next few days, I moved through routines as if nothing had changed. I answered messages politely. I returned calls. I showed up where expected. All the while, I observed timing and language noting when Frank spoke in generalities and when he avoided specifics. That avoidance told me where to look next. At night, when the apartment was quiet, I reviewed public records and basic trust structures, not to jump to conclusions, but to understand what was possible within the window he had mentioned. The work felt methodical, almost soothing. It gave my anger a place to go without letting it spill where it would be used against me. One evening, after a particularly long day, I got into my car and drove without a destination, letting instinct guide me toward the familiar curve of the road along Lake Washington. The city lights reflected off the water in broken lines, and the hum of traffic faded into a steady background sound. I rolled the window down and let the cold air clear my head. I did not rehearse speeches. I did not imagine confrontations. I repeated one sentence to myself, slow and deliberate. I will not beg for fairness. The words anchored me. Begging implies permission. I was done asking for permission. As the car moved along the shoreline, I sorted the strategy into 3 clear requirements, the same way I would outline a plan for work. First, document trail. Every claim needed a paper path, something verifiable that did not rely on memory or interpretation. Emails, statements, filings, anything that showed intent and movement. Second, witness context. Not dramatic testimony, but people who could confirm timing procedure or standard practice. Accountants, administrators, anyone whose role intersected quietly with the process. Third, legal standing. I needed to act within my rights, not as a challenge, but as a participant. That meant understanding exactly what my position was as a beneficiary and what access that position allowed. Without those 3 elements, everything else would be noise. With them, the truth would carry its own weight. The calm that followed surprised me. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The next morning, I reviewed my notes and refined the questions, stripping away anything that sounded emotional or speculative. I did not write, "Why did you do this?" I wrote, "When was this filed?" I did not write, "This is unfair." I wrote, "Please confirm." Language mattered. Tone mattered. The goal was not to expose yet, but to prepare. At work, I handled tasks with the same precision, the same focus, letting the familiarity of process reinforce my sense of control. When doubts surfaced, they were brief and manageable. What if I was wrong? What if I misunderstood something? Each doubt had an answer rooted in verification. I did not need certainty yet. I needed access. That afternoon, I drafted a short email and read it several times before sending it, checking for neutrality, for clarity, for the absence of accusation. I addressed it properly using formal language and a subject line that sounded routine. Request copy of trust summary. In the body, I identified myself simply and accurately, referencing my status without elaboration. I requested a copy of the trust summary under a beneficiary inquiry, citing a need for personal records. There were no demands. There was no urgency implied, just a clear, reasonable request that could not be dismissed without explanation. Before sending it, I paused and took a breath, aware that this was the first visible move I was making. If you are watching, this is where quiet people win. I clicked send. The email left my outbox without drama disappearing into the system the way all important things do at first. I closed my laptop and stood by the window looking out at the city, feeling the steady resolve that comes when a plan replaces confusion. Whatever happened next would happen on record. The reply to my beneficiary inquiry did not arrive with drama or resistance. It came the way most things do when people assume you will not read closely, polite, procedural, and incomplete. A brief acknowledgement, a promise to follow up, enough to confirm that my request had landed. While I waited, I began assembling what I could access without asking anyone for permission. Justice does not announce itself at the beginning. It accumulates quietly, document by document, timestamp by timestamp. I started with the family bank statements I still had authorized access to, the accounts Frank had never bothered to remove me from because he believed attention was the same thing as control. The statements showed patterns more than numbers, regular withdrawals that aligned with business expenses. Frank referenced casualty deposits that did not match income sources I recognized. I did not jump to conclusions. I created a simple spreadsheet and logged dates, amounts, and descriptions, letting the shape of the activity emerge on its own. Next came last year's tax filings. I had copies saved from when I helped organize records months earlier, a task Frank had assigned to me without thinking. I reviewed them carefully, noting how certain deductions appeared under different categories, how an education-related expense I recognized had been reclassified. Nothing illegal on its face. Everything suggestive. That was the point. Paper trails rarely shout. They whisper until you line them up. I requested copies of corporate meeting minutes through channels available to shareholders, again using neutral language and standard procedure. When the documents arrived, I read them slowly, looking not just at what was discussed, but at what was deferred. Shares were mentioned in broad strokes with authority delegated to a small group. My name appeared once early on, then disappeared entirely in later summaries. I cross-referenced dates with the bank activity and felt the pieces begin to lock together. Emails with the estate lawyer followed, forwarded to me as part of the trust summary packet that finally arrived 2 days later. The summary was clean, intentionally high level, but it confirmed something important. Assets once labeled under education fund were now grouped under business expansion. The change was framed as strategic alignment. The effect was unmistakable. Funds earmarked for my development had been absorbed into Ryan's ventures. The amounts were not listed in the summary, but the timing aligned with the withdrawals I had logged. When I overlaid the figures, the scale became clear. The movement tied directly to the $5.2 million Frank had referenced at the table, not as a single transfer, but as a series of reallocations that produced the same outcome. This was the break, not because it was shocking, but because it was traceable. I remembered something an old colleague once said: "The paper trail always exists. It just waits for someone patient enough to follow it." I needed confirmation beyond my own analysis, not to prove intent, but to establish context. I did not call lawyers yet. I did not threaten. I reached out to people whose jobs intersected with the process in ordinary ways. A familiar accounting clerk who had worked with the family for years, a bank representative who recognized my name and spoke freely within policy. I asked simple questions. Can you confirm when this category changed? Is this standard procedure? Who authorized the reclassification? I did not accuse. I did not imply wrongdoing. I listened. The answers came carefully, but they came. The accounting clerk mentioned that the rename had been requested with urgency, flagged as time-sensitive. The bank representative confirmed that the transfers were internal, but unusual in sequence, executed quickly and with minimal review. Neither said Frank's name out loud. They did not need to. I thanked them and documented the conversations, immediately noting dates and exact phrasing. By the end of the week, my folder held statements, summaries, emails, minutes, and notes from conversations that painted a coherent picture. It was not dramatic. It was precise. Late one night, as I organized the files, I opened a subfolder I had not touched since my mother died. Inside were scanned copies of documents she had insisted I keep her handwriting visible in the margins. I compared them to the current trust summary and felt a quiet certainty settle in. Something was missing. I searched again, deeper this time, and found it. An older version of the will, signed and witnessed, with my mother's signature, clear at the bottom. Attached was a clause Frank had never mentioned, one that outlined conditions for reallocation and beneficiary consent. The language was careful and firm. It did not prevent change. It required transparency. Frank had avoided that requirement by restructuring labels and timing, not by honoring intent. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the significance of it register. This was not about feelings anymore. It was about records. As I saved the document into the evidence folder, I felt the steady build of something solid beneath me. Justice was not coming. It was already being assembled. I chose an estate attorney the same way I chose everything else in this process, quietly and with intent, not someone flashy, but someone whose work history suggested patience and precision. The office was understated neutral colors, framed certificates that looked earned rather than decorative. When we sat down, I did not begin with feelings or family history. I began with status. I am a named beneficiary, I said, and I am requesting clarity on trust administration and asset reclassification. The attorney nodded, once not surprised, and asked me to walk through the timeline. I did month by month, sticking to dates and documents, sliding copies across the desk in a clean stack. As I spoke, I watched for reactions, small shifts in posture or attention. When I mentioned the education fund rename and the reclassification under business expansion, the attorney paused and asked a precise question about authorization. I answered with what I knew and what I had verified. If you are a beneficiary, she said, you have the right to request documents and a formal accounting. That right does not depend on approval from other family members. The statement landed like a door opening. She continued explaining that the structure mattered, but that manipulating an education fund or trust assets without disclosure could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty and potentially fraud depending on intent and execution. She was careful with language the way professionals are when they leave room for evidence to speak. I did not interrupt. I did not ask her to escalate yet. I asked what steps preserved options. She outlined them clearly. A letter of representation to establish counsel, a request for accounting to compel transparency, and if necessary, a motion to freeze certain transfers to prevent further movement while the review was underway. None of it sounded dramatic. All of it sounded effective. As we reviewed the documents together, I used the same terms she did: trust, corpus reallocation, beneficiary consent, administrative discretion. She looked up at me, then assessing. You have done your homework, she said. Most people come in angry. You came in organized. I shrugged slightly and said I preferred accuracy. The corner of her mouth lifted a small acknowledgement. She flipped to the older will. I had found the one with my mother's signature and the condition Frank had avoided. This clause is important, she said. It does not block change, but it requires disclosure and accounting. Avoiding signatures by relabeling does not erase that obligation. She tapped the page lightly. This gives us standing. We began to frame the approach not as an attack, but as a compliance exercise. The letter of representation would be neutral, factual, establishing that communication should route through counsel. The accounting request would specify timeframes and categories without accusing anyone of wrongdoing. The potential freeze would remain a contingency to be used only if transfers continued during review. I agreed with the sequencing. Verify, then compel, then protect. At one point, she asked about my work, casual but curious perhaps to understand capacity. I answered briefly using accurate but minimal descriptions. She nodded again. You are not naive. She said more statement than compliment. I felt a quiet satisfaction at that, not because I needed validation, but because it confirmed my read of the room. Power respects clarity. Before we finalized the plan, she asked one question that mattered. Do you want to do this quietly or publicly? I did not hesitate. Public, I said. They only respect witnesses. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded as if that answer resolved something for her as well. We agreed on next steps and timelines. As I left the office, the weight I had been carrying shifted into something steadier. This was no longer just preparation. It was a legal posture with teeth measured and visible. I walked to my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, reviewing the plan in my head. Letter of representation first, accounting request second, monitor transfers continuously, preserve evidence. Everything stayed within the outline we had set. Nothing rushed, nothing emotional. When I drove away, I felt the stakes rise, not because the situation had worsened, but because it had become real in a way that could not be smoothed over with smiles. Somewhere between the office and the freeway, I understood that whatever came next would unfold on record with witnesses, and that was exactly where it needed to be. Began the moment I sent the calendar invite and watched the read receipts appear one by one, the subject line deliberately bland, estate clarity and tax planning, because neutral language is what people trust right before they underestimate you. I chose a weekday afternoon when no one could claim distraction, and I suggested Frank's office because control makes people careless. I kept my tone polite in every message, the kind that signals cooperation rather than confrontation, and I did not include attachments, only the promise of organization. Frank responded last, a curt acknowledgement without warmth, and from that moment the temperature shifted. The house felt colder when I visited to confirm logistics, not physically but socially, the kind of cold that shows up as silence where there used to be small talk. Frank avoided eye contact past me in the hallway without comment, and when he did speak, it was edged. Don't get ambitious now, he said once, as if ambition were a flaw I had just developed. The sentence landed with intent, a reminder of hierarchy, and I nodded as if I agreed. Ryan was less subtle. He caught me near the garage one evening and lowered his voice, smiling without humor. Don't make Dad upset, he said. You'll regret it. The words were casual, the threat implied rather than stated, and that was the value point I needed, the smell of risk to assets and position that told me pressure was working. I did not argue. I did not warn. I went home and finalized the evidence packet. I kept it simple by design, a one-page timeline with dates and amounts that told the story without commentary. 5 primary documents chosen for clarity rather than volume. The education fund rename email, the transfer record showing movement into business expansion, the company meeting minutes, referencing share reallocation, the trust clause from my mother's will requiring disclosure, and the recent correspondence indicating administrative discretion being used to avoid signatures. I arranged them in the order that would force recognition before denial. Then I wrote 2 questions, not accusations. Questions shaped to corner the truth. The first asked who authorized the reclassification of the education fund and on what date. The second asked whether all beneficiaries had been notified prior to the attempted transfer. Both required either honesty or an obvious dodge. As I assembled the packet, I felt the shift from preparation to staging. This was no longer about gathering facts, but about controlling sequence and witnesses. I coordinated with my attorney on presence and timing, making sure representation would be available by phone if needed, but not intrusive. The goal was exposure through structure, not spectacle. Frank sensed it. His comments sharpened his patience, thinned. He began to correct me publicly on small things that did not matter, as if reasserting dominance would change the math. Ryan echoed him, leaning into jokes about complexity and overthinking testing, whether ridicule would slow me. It did not. The night before the meeting, as I reviewed the packet one last time, my phone lit up with a message from the bank contact I had spoken to earlier. It was brief and factual. An attempt had been made to rush transfer one item pending review, timing tomorrow morning. I stared at the screen, not surprised, only confirmed. That move told me everything about proximity to the breaking point. I forwarded the message to my attorney and added the timestamp to the timeline. Then I closed the folder and set it by the door ready. The mini hook was clear in my mind as I turned off the lights. If they needed to rush, it meant they were already losing control. The meeting opened exactly the way I expected, with Frank taking the head of the table and clearing his throat as if he were beginning a board briefing instead of a family review. His voice measured and deliberately patronizing when he looked at me and said, "Let's keep this simple for you." I felt the familiar pressure to shrink the old reflex to nod and wait my turn, but I did not move. I did not raise my voice either. I spoke first calmly in Japanese, the same register he had used at dinner, and said, "You said I wasn't leadership material." The room went still. Not dramatic, just emptied of noise, because shock does not always arrive loudly. Frank blinked once, then frowned, the calculation visible as he tried to decide whether to deny understanding or to pretend it did not matter. I stayed cold and precise, switching back to English without apology. I told them I would walk through the materials in order, and that questions could wait. I slid the first document forward, the email thread showing the education fund renamed to Ryan Development. The timestamps highlighted the amounts unchanged, but the intent altered. I explained nothing beyond the dates and asked Frank to confirm authorship. He waved it off, said names were administrative, said I was overreading. I moved to the transfer records next, showing the movement from the renamed fund into business expansion, the amounts aligning with the larger inheritance number that had been discussed in Japanese. I let the papers speak and then paused long enough for the silence to do its work. Then I placed the company documents on the table, the meeting minutes that traced the share movement plan, the chain of custody that led to a trust designed for Ryan, the absence of my name, where it should have appeared. I did not accuse. I asked for confirmation of process. Frank leaned back, crossed his arms, and said this was all perfectly normal, that families made decisions, that I was being emotional. I slid the next page forward, the clause from my mother's trust requiring disclosure and beneficiary notice prior to any material transfer, her language clear and unambiguous. That was when his jaw tightened. He said the clause was outdated, said it did not apply, said he had discretion. That was the point where my attorney entered the room by voice, not body, the letter already printed and placed face down until now. I turned it over and read the header aloud. Representation confirmed request for accounting. Issued notice that attempted transfers without disclosure could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty depending on structure. Frank reached for the page, then stopped the first visible crack. He said this was unnecessary, said we could talk privately. I kept the sequence moving and placed the final item on the table. The notification of the attempted rush transfer from the night before the timestamp aligned with the meeting invite. That was the breaking point. He denied it outright, then contradicted himself within a sentence, then blamed timing. Ryan snapped, then the mask gone, his voice sharp as he leaned forward and said, "So what, you want money?" The question hung there crude and revealing. I looked at him and answered without heat. "I want accounting, and I want it on record." I said it slowly enough to make it permanent. I added that transparency was not punishment and that accuracy was not aggression. Frank started to speak again, then stopped when my phone rang on the table, the screen lighting up with the trust administrator name. I answered on speaker. The voice was professional and brief, confirming that pending review, the identified transfer had been temporarily paused, effective immediately. No commentary, just fact. The room absorbed it. I closed the call and looked at them both, not with triumph, but with finality. If you have ever been told you are too much, watch what happens when the facts speak. The silence that followed was not empty this time. It was complete. Frank chose a quiet coffee shop in Bellevue with neutral colors and soft music, the kind of place where conversations blur into background noise. And when he sat across from me, he used the voice he saved for authority disguised as care, leaning in slightly and saying, "We can fix this quietly," as if volume were the problem and not intent. He spoke like a father, first mentioning how tired I looked, how stress was not good for family, then pivoted without pause into control, lowering his tone and explaining that public records had a way of damaging reputations and that people talked. He slid a folded paper toward me without letting go of it, explaining that it outlined a reasonable adjustment, a small percentage allocated to me in recognition of feelings contingent on discretion, his word for silence. He added the familiar refrain about family reputation, about how neighbors and colleagues would misunderstand about how this would all look unnecessary if handled internally. I listened without interrupting, noting the way his eyes checked my hands for reaction, the way he framed generosity as mercy. When he finished, I did not touch the paper. I said one sentence evenly and without emphasis. "You offered me silence. I am choosing record." He blinked, recalculated, and tried again this time with urgency creeping in, suggesting timelines, suggesting that I did not want this to escalate, suggesting that I was young and could not predict consequences. I repeated nothing, added nothing, simply pushed my phone forward and said that all communication would be in writing, going forward. He stiffened the father mask slipping and warned me not to be difficult. I stood, paid for my coffee, and left him there with the paper still between us. That afternoon, Ryan texted me, not bothering with pretense, saying I was making things hard and that I would regret it if I did not back off. I did not respond. I forwarded the message to my attorney and saved it along with the earlier emails and meeting notes, creating a single timeline file with timestamps intact. That was the value point I had learned to trust. Documentation does not argue, it waits. Frank called twice that evening and left one voicemail, his tone shifting again to concern, then to irritation, then to warning each version preserved. I did not answer. I replied by email, only confirming receipt and reiterating that future contact should go through counsel. The next morning, my attorney called to brief me, calmly explaining that continued attempts to influence or bargain could carry specific legal consequences, given the fiduciary issues already on record, and that restraint now was in Frank's interest whether he recognized it or not. I thanked her and closed the call, feeling the strange steadiness that comes when pressure clarifies instead of crushing. Frank sent one more message that day, shorter, saying he hoped I would reconsider for the sake of peace. I archived it. The line had been crossed and documented. The consequences did not arrive as a single blow, but as a controlled sequence that unfolded over weeks, each step quieter than the last, and therefore harder to deny. The trust accounting became mandatory once the formal request was acknowledged, and the tone of the process shifted from family discretion to institutional procedure calendars set, documents requested, confirmations logged. Statements were produced that showed movements Frank had always described as temporary or strategic, now framed plainly against the governing clauses, and several transfers tied to the renamed fund were either reversed or reallocated according to the original terms. Nothing dramatic happened in public, no raised voices or apologies, just letters and notices that reduced Frank's control in measurable ways. His authority narrowed as the accounting progressed, portions of decision-making moved to oversight, and the company shares he once treated as personal leverage were subjected to disclosure requirements that stripped away his ability to maneuver alone. I watched this without celebration, noting only that transparency had weight. Ryan felt the shift first. The cushion he relied on thinned as access tightened, and the expectation that family resources would absorb his risks evaporated. He lost standing in rooms where he had spoken confidently before, and when obligations surfaced that could not be deferred, he was required to meet them himself. The anger that followed did not reach me directly. It arrived, filtered through others, through updates and secondhand remarks, and I kept my distance, maintaining the boundary I had set. I did not add pressure or seek advantage beyond what the process required. My role remained limited to responding when asked and reviewing what was placed in front of me. The pace slowed deliberately, allowing the reality to settle. In the quieter moments, I noticed the absence of the old tension in my body, the constant readiness to explain or justify, replaced by a steadier calm. I drove familiar routes and focused on ordinary tasks, letting the work complete itself. Near the end of that period, I returned to my apartment one evening and opened a box I had kept sealed since my mother died, a simple container of papers and small keepsakes. At the bottom was a letter in her handwriting, folded once addressed to me. She wrote plainly, acknowledging that she had seen the dynamics clearly, that she had anticipated attempts to redirect what was meant for me, and that the conditions she insisted on were there to protect rather than provoke. She told me not to mistake silence for consent and reminded me that accuracy was a form of care. I sat with the letter for a long time, understanding finally that what I had done was not a surprise to her, but a continuation. I moved a few weeks later, not far and not dramatically, just enough to change the rhythm of my days, trading the familiar streets near Bellevue for a quieter place, closer to Redmond, where mornings felt less watched and evenings felt earned. I did not announce it as a statement. I signed a lease, packed what mattered, and let the rest follow. Distance clarified things. The process with the trust continued on its own track, steady and procedural, and my involvement narrowed to review and confirmation. In that quieter space, something else unfolded, something I had kept deliberately small for a long time. The project that required Japanese had never been a hobby or a favor. It was a long-running engagement that had grown in scope and trust, built on accuracy and restraint, the kind of work that does not reward noise. One afternoon, an email arrived with a subject line I had seen before final approval confirmed, followed by an invitation to step into a lead localization role for a major transaction that required judgment more than volume. It came with a clear scope, a timeline and compensation that reflected responsibility rather than flash. I accepted without ceremony. Alongside it was confirmation of a modest equity grant tied to the outcome of an earlier phase, not a windfall and not symbolic, just real enough to matter and earn the slow way. It was the quiet completion of a pattern I had chosen long ago, proof that I did not need to ask for money in rooms that required obedience, and that my insistence on accounting had never been about enrichment. It had been about principle and about my mother. With that settled, I did one more thing small by design. I set up a micro-scholarship fund in her name, focused and practical, aimed at a narrow need she had once cared about deeply. The paperwork was simple, the criteria clear, the amounts manageable. It was not a monument, it was a continuation. I named it after her and filed the documents myself, feeling the weight lift as the purpose found its place. Life did not turn into a victory montage. It returned to ordinary textures, work done well, evenings read quietly, weekends planned without strategy. The anger that had sharpened my focus softened into something else, a steadier confidence that did not require witnesses. I saw my father once more at a distance through updates and formal notices, his role adjusted permanently, his influence bounded by the structures he had tried to bend. Ryan faded from my daily awareness entirely. When I thought about family, it was without the old urge to translate myself. I had learned that family is not a license to erase you. If this hit home, tell me where you are watching from and what boundary you wish you had set sooner. And months later, Ryan showed up with one sentence that proved he had learned nothing.